In the year 1844, beneath one of the busiest streets in Brooklyn, a tunnel was carved through the earth in less than 7 months. It was the first subway tunnel ever built in North America. It was paid for by some of the wealthiest men in New York. It stretched nearly half a mile in a perfect straight line under Atlantic Avenue. Then, in 1861, at the very moment the United States was fracturing into civil war, the tunnel was sealed. Both ends were bricked shut. The maps were quietly revised. Every official record claimed the structure had been filled in with rubble and rendered useless. For 120 years, the city of Brooklyn carried on above it, paving over it again and again, raising buildings on top of it, laying gas lines and water mains across it, and forgetting it had ever existed. But the tunnel was never filled in. It was sealed. And the question that historians have circled for more than a century, the question that the railroad companies refuse to answer I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Any public hearing, the question that the legislators who passed the laws around it never quite explained, is a simple one. Why would anyone spend the equivalent of millions of dollars to build a tunnel, operate it profitably for 17 years, and then suddenly seal it shut and pretend it was never there? Tonight we are going to answer that question. We are going to look at who paid for it, who benefited from sealing it, and what they did not want the public to see. Before we go any further, if you find stories like this one fascinating, the lost economic history that does not make it into the textbooks, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and to give this video a like. It genuinely helps more than you know, and it allows us to keep producing long-form documentary research like this. Now, let us return to Brooklyn, to the spring of 1844, and to the world that gave rise to one of the strangest pieces of infrastructure ever built in the city. To understand why this tunnel was built, you have to understand what Brooklyn was in 1844. It was not yet part of New York City. It was a separate municipality, the 7th largest city in the United States, growing at a rate that frightened the older merchant families of Manhattan. Brooklyn had a deep water harbor. It had farmland to the east stretching all the way to Montauk Point. It had ferry connections to Manhattan that ran every 15 minutes, and in the early 1830s it had become the western terminus of one of the most ambitious infrastructure projects in the country, the Long Island Railroad. The original idea behind the Long Island Railroad was not to serve Long Island. That is something most people do not understand. The original idea was to use Long Island as a shortcut. Steam locomotives in those years could not safely cross the long water gaps along the southern coast of Connecticut. The shoreline route between New York and Boston was broken by inlet after inlet, ferry after ferry, and the bridges that could carry a locomotive across them had not yet been built. So the directors of the Long Island Railroad, working with the most powerful financial interests in Manhattan, devised a plan. They would run a single uninterrupted rail line from the Brooklyn waterfront, the full length of Long Island, to Greenport on the eastern tip. At Greenport, passengers and cargo would board a steam ferry across Long Island Sound to Stonington, Connecticut. From Stonington, another railroad would carry them onward to Boston. The total time from Manhattan to Boston, by this method, would be roughly 11 hours. Compared to the alternative, which was 26 hours by stagecoach or 38 hours by steamer rounding Cape Cod, 11 hours was a transformation of the American economy. It would have made New York and Boston, the two most important commercial cities in the country, effectively neighbors. The men who funded the Long Island Railroad understood that whoever controlled this corridor would hold a powerful position in the freight and passenger trade between the two great ports of the Northeast. The Long Island Railroad was never simply a transport company. It was, from the moment of its incorporation, a structural economic instrument. And that brings us to the problem of Brooklyn. The original western terminus of the line was at South Ferry, on the Brooklyn waterfront. From there, locomotives needed to travel inland to reach the open country of Long Island. The route that had been chosen ran straight down Atlantic Avenue. In the early years, the trains rolled down the avenue at street level. They shared the road with horses and carriages and pedestrians, and as Brooklyn grew, as the houses along Atlantic Avenue multiplied and the side streets filled in with stores and stables and tenements, the trains became a public hazard. Children were killed, horses bolted, steam and cinders fell on the laundry strung between buildings. Property values along Atlantic Avenue, which had been rising steadily, began to stall. The residents petitioned the city. The city threatened the railroad. The railroad needed a solution that would let it run heavier locomotives at higher speeds on a tighter schedule without political interference. The solution was to put the railroad underground. The construction began in May of 1844. The method used was called cut and cover. Workers dug a long trench down the length of Atlantic Avenue, lined it with brick and stone, raised an arched roof of the same materials, and then backfilled the surface and repaved the street above. The trench ran for roughly 2,500 feet, more or less half a mile, in a perfectly straight line from the East River waterfront eastward to what is today the neighborhood of Boerum Hill. The walls of the tunnel were laid up in courses of Manhattan schist and locally fired brick. The arch above was supported by a continuous masonry vault. The interior height ranged from around 17 feet at the center to a little lower at the haunches. The interior width was roughly 21 feet, broad enough for 2 tracks and a service walkway. Those dimensions are not in dispute. They have been measured directly by every engineer who has surveyed the structure since its rediscovery, and they match the original drawings filed with the Brooklyn City engineer. What is remarkable about those measurements is how durable the construction has proven. There are railway tunnels built 50 years later, with the benefit of 50 years of engineering progress, that have failed catastrophically. This one has not. The vault has held its shape for nearly 2 centuries, in waterlogged Brooklyn soil, under the weight of trolley lines and gas mains and apartment buildings, and the constant vibration of a dense urban grid. By December of 1844, locomotives were rolling through it, 7 months from groundbreaking to operation. Think about what that means. Think about the labour required, the volume of earth moved by hand and by horse cart, the brick fired and hauled and laid, the timber framing raised and pulled, the surface of one of the busiest avenues in Brooklyn torn open and put back together in the span of 2 seasons. The workforce that did this was not recorded in any company census that survives. We do not know exactly how many men dug the trench. We do not know how many died doing it, although in the conditions of mid-19th century cut and cover construction, with no ventilation, no shoring standards, no compensation for the families of the injured, deaths were a near certainty. What we do know is that the labour was largely Irish, drawn from the waves of famine migration that were arriving in Brooklyn in those same years, and that the wages paid were at the bottom of the New York labour market. We also know that the construction was paid for almost entirely by private capital. No municipal bond was issued, no federal land grant was applied for, no state subsidy was disbursed. A handful of private investors put up the money in exchange for a share of the projected freight and passenger revenue on the New York to Boston route that the tunnel was supposed to unlock. The exact list of those investors is not part of the surviving public record. The Long Island Railroad of that era was not a transparent enterprise. Its board minutes were not published, its accounts were not audited by any outside party, and many of its records were lost in the decades of corporate reorganizations and mergers that followed. What we can say with confidence is that the men who paid for the tunnel were not small investors. The sums involved required either a single, very wealthy backer or a small consortium of New York financial figures, and the calculations of return required a level of patient capital that ordinary speculators did not possess. Whoever they were sophisticated, and they had decided that a tunnel beneath a Brooklyn avenue was worth a fortune in private silver. The question is what they thought they were buying. The official answer was a faster railway. The deeper answer, and the answer that the rest of this story will turn on, was control of the corridor between New York and Boston, and through that corridor, control of the price of nearly every commodity that moved between the two great commercial cities of the Northeast. For the next 15 years, the tunnel did exactly what its builders had promised. Trains rolled through it on a tight schedule. Freight moved through it in volumes that the surface alternative could never have handled. And the New York to Boston route, the great strategic prize, began to function in something like the form its planners had imagined. A passenger could leave a hotel in Lower Manhattan in the early morning, cross the East River on the Atlantic Avenue ferry, board a Long Island Railroad train at the South Ferry Terminal, descend into the tunnel, emerge in open country east of Brooklyn, ride across the length of Long Island to the village of Greenport at the eastern tip, transfer to a steam ferry across the Sound to Stonington in Connecticut, and connect there to a New England railroad bound for Boston. The total time, when everything ran on schedule, was somewhere between 10 and 11 hours. Compared to the alternatives, it was a transformation. Walt Whitman, who was then editing the Brooklyn Daily Eagle and walking Atlantic Avenue almost every day, took notice of the structure beneath the street. His later writing about it would describe a passage of darkness beneath the city, a kind of subterranean cathedral that the citizens of Brooklyn passed over without ever seeing. Whitman, who was a poet of public things, of ferries and avenues and crowds, understood that the tunnel was something genuinely new in the world. There had been mining tunnels before, there had been canal tunnels before, but this was different. This was urban infrastructure of a kind that had no precedent. A piece of the modern city, hidden underground, carrying the freight of an entire region through the silent earth. The economic statistics from those years tell the story plainly. Freight tonnage on the Long Island Railroad grew steadily through the late 1840s and into the 1850s. Passenger volume rose with it. The Brooklyn waterfront, which had been a secondary harbour in the era of sail, began to compete seriously with the Manhattan docks for the transshipment trade. Property values along Atlantic Avenue, which had stalled in the years of grade-level rail, began to rise. The tunnel had done what tunnels are supposed to do. It had taken a piece of infrastructure that the city wanted to be invisible, and made it invisible, and in doing so had unlocked an entire layer of economic activity that could not have existed otherwise. And then, almost without warning, the political ground beneath the railroad began to shift. The opposition that would ultimately seal the tunnel did not come from the residents of Atlantic Avenue. They had largely been satisfied by the construction. It did not come from the press. The Brooklyn newspapers covered the railroad with a tone that ranged from enthusiastic to merely respectful. It came from somewhere else. It came from a coalition of commercial interests in Manhattan whose own businesses depended on the routes that the Long Island Railroad was beginning to undercut. And to understand that coalition, you have to look at the other side of the East River, at the men who were watching the success of the Brooklyn Tunnel with a growing and very specific kind of alarm. The first group of opponents were the steamship operators. Long before the railroads dominated the corridor between New York and Boston, before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. Connection between those two cities had belonged to the boats. The Long Island Sound was one of the busiest pieces of water in the world. Sidewheel steamers ran between the East River piers and the Connecticut and Rhode Island ports on schedules nearly as tight as the railroads, and they did so at a cost structure that the early railroads could not match. The men who owned those steamships were among the wealthiest figures in the city. Cornelius Vanderbilt in this period was still primarily a steamship operator. He had not yet begun his great consolidation of the New York railroads. His personal fortune was built on the Sound. Other operators, the Fall River Line, the Stonington Line, the Norwich and Worcester Service, all had similar economic interests. The Long Island Railroad, with its tunnel and its ferry transfer at Greenport, was a direct competitive threat. If the railroad route succeeded, the steamship route would lose its monopoly on time, and the men who owned the boats did not intend to let that happen. The second group of opponents were the rival railroads. Even as the Brooklyn Tunnel was carrying its first locomotives, engineers in Connecticut were surveying the shoreline route between New York and Boston that the early railroads had been told was impossible. The technology of trestle bridges and steam pile drivers was advancing year by year. The inlets that had blocked a direct land route were beginning to look bridgeable. The New York and New Haven Railroad, the Hartford and New Haven, the Boston and Providence, all of them were building toward a direct shoreline corridor that would make the Long Island detour obsolete. They had every reason to want the Brooklyn Tunnel rendered surplus. The third group of opponents were the property interests along Atlantic Avenue itself. The earlier complaints about safety and smoke had never fully disappeared. The tunnel had moved the locomotives underground, but the surface of the avenue still carried the approach tracks and the marshalling yards. Brooklyn was growing. Residential development was pushing eastward. The land along the rail corridor was worth more for housing than for railroad infrastructure, and the owners of that land understood it. They began to organize. They began to petition the city, the county, and the state. They began to press for legislation that would force the railroad off the surface of Brooklyn entirely, and that would, by extension, render the tunnel beneath it operationally useless. These three coalitions, the steamship men, the rival railroads, and the Brooklyn property interests, did not coordinate openly. There is no surviving document that records a meeting between them, but the political effect of their combined pressure is visible in the legislative record. Through the late 1850s, pressure mounted in Albany for restrictions on steam locomotive operation in Brooklyn, and in 1859 that pressure broke through. The New York State Legislature passed a law that effectively banned steam locomotives from operating on the streets of Brooklyn south of the existing city limits. The law did not name the Atlantic Avenue Tunnel directly. It did not have to. The route that the tunnel served was a Brooklyn street route. Without legal access to that terminus, the tunnel had no economic purpose. The structure would still stand, but no one could profit from crossing it. The Long Island Railroad understood the moment the law was signed what had happened to its tunnel. The 1859 law gave the railroad 2 years to wind down its Brooklyn operations. During those 2 years, the company made every legal effort to overturn the legislation. The lawyers filed challenges in the state courts. The lobbyists pressed for amendments in Albany. The shareholders organized public meetings. None of it worked. The political coalition behind the law was too broad and too deeply rooted to be moved by a single railroad company, no matter how well capitalized. So the directors of the Long Island Railroad did what any rational firm would do in the same position. They relocated. They moved their western terminus from the Brooklyn waterfront to a new facility on the East River side of Queens at a place called Hunter's Point in what is today Long Island City. From Hunter's Point, passengers and freight could reach Manhattan by ferry directly, without ever crossing Brooklyn at all. The tunnel was no longer on the route. The tunnel was no longer needed, and the directors of the railroad, having spent a fortune to build it, now had to decide what to do with it. There were three options. They could fill it in completely with rubble and earth, which would be expensive and largely irreversible. They could leave it open, walled at the entrances, but vulnerable to flooding, gas accumulation, and the kind of unauthorized use that would create endless legal liability. Or they could seal it, brick up both portals, document the closure in the city engineer's office, and walk away. They chose the third option. In the late autumn of 1861, the tunnel was sealed at both ends. The work was done quietly. There was no ceremony. There was no press coverage in any major newspaper. The country was, by that point, deep into the first year of the Civil War, and the closing of a Brooklyn railway tunnel was not the kind of story that competed for newspaper space against the dispatches from Bull Run and the casualty lists from Virginia. The only contemporary writer who paid sustained attention to the closure was Walt Whitman. By that time, he was no longer at the Brooklyn Daily Eagle. He was writing for a small paper called the Brooklyn Standard, mostly historical pieces about the neighborhoods he had grown up in. And in one of those pieces, in the summer of 1861, he wrote about the tunnel. He described it in a passage that has since been quoted in nearly every history of the structure as a passage of solemnity and darkness, a place that had carried the noise and motion of the city beneath the surface of the city, and that was now closed and filled up and soon to be utterly forgotten. He wrote about the way it had been built. He wrote about the men who had worked in it. He wrote about the strange fact that something so substantial, so permanent in its construction, could be sealed away and erased from public memory within the span of a single generation. Whitman was right about the erasure, and wrong only about the speed of it. Within 10 years, most Brooklynites had no idea the tunnel was there. Within 20 years, even the railroad officials who had inherited the company from the original generation were unsure of the exact location of the entrances. Within 50 years, the tunnel had passed entirely out of the official memory of the city. It existed only in rumour, in the occasional reminiscence of an old labourer, in the inherited stories of families who had lived along Atlantic Avenue when the locomotives had still been running. The avenue above was paved and repaved. New buildings rose along its length. Gas lines were laid across the line of the tunnel without anyone realizing they were crossing it. Water mains were sunk into the soil above its vault. The vault itself held, the arch held, the walls held, the tunnel waited. In the absence of memory, the tunnel acquired legend. This is what happens when a piece of substantial infrastructure is forgotten by the official record, but not entirely by the city around it. The structure leaves a faint residue in the folklore, and over decades that residue accretes into stories. The earliest legend was about pirate treasure. Brooklyn in the 1870s and 1880s was a city saturated in the mythology of Captain Kidd, the 17th century privateer whose name had attached itself to nearly every coastal hollow and root cellar along the Long Island shore. By the late 19th century, when the tunnel had been sealed for a generation, and its true purpose was no longer common knowledge, it had become natural to imagine it as a hiding place. Storytellers placed Kidd's lost gold somewhere behind one of its bricked entrances. Newspaper articles in the 1890s speculated about underground vaults filled with Spanish coins. None of this had any historical basis. Kidd had been hanged in London in 1701, more than a century before the tunnel was built. But the legend persisted, and it persisted because the public needed an explanation for why a substantial piece of brick and stone had been sealed away and abandoned, and pirate gold was a satisfying explanation. The second legend, which emerged in the 20th century, concerned the missing pages of the diary of John Wilkes Booth. After Booth was killed in 1865, a diary was found on his body, and several pages of that diary were missing. In the version of the speculation that attached itself to the Atlantic Avenue tunnel, the missing pages were said to have been hidden in the sealed structure by Confederate sympathizers in Brooklyn. There is no documentary evidence for this. There is no contemporary account that links Booth to Brooklyn. But the story spread through pulp journalism and the oral culture of the waterfront, and by the middle of the 20th century it had become one of the standard claims about the tunnel. The third legend, which emerged during the Second World War, concerned German espionage. There were genuine cases of German agents operating in New York Harbor during the war, and in the climate of suspicion that surrounded those cases, the seal tunnel became a plausible setting for imagined activity. Some accounts placed German agents using the tunnel to store explosives. Some placed transmitters in it. None of these claims appears in any declassified intelligence record. But the story gave the tunnel a contemporary mystery to wear over the older ones, and the public continued to find it compelling. The fourth legend, the most modest and possibly the most true, concerned the era of Prohibition. Brooklyn in the 1920s had a significant smuggling economy, and it would have been surprising if no bootlegger had ever attempted to use the sealed tunnel for storage. There are scattered second-hand reports of men breaking through the brick at one of the entrances, in the late 20s, although no police record confirms an arrest there. None of these legends explains the structure. None of them touches the actual economic history that put the tunnel there or sealed it. But they kept the memory of the tunnel alive in the city in fragmentary and distorted form through more than a century, during which the official record had effectively erased it. The rediscovery came in 1981, and it came not from a city agency, not from a railroad, not from an archaeological expedition, but from a single 20-year-old engineering student named Bob Diamond. Diamond had grown up in Brooklyn, had heard the legends about a sealed tunnel somewhere beneath Atlantic Avenue, and had become convinced, against the advice of nearly everyone around him, that the tunnel was still there. He spent months in the basement of Brooklyn Borough Hall, going through 19th century engineering records that had not been requested by any researcher in living memory. He found the original drawings, he measured the locations, he identified a manhole at the intersection of Court Street and Atlantic Avenue that the surface record suggested would open directly above the tunnel vault. He persuaded the city to let him enter. In the summer of 1981, with a flashlight and a crowbar and a small group of friends, Diamond descended through that manhole, broke through a layer of compacted soil, and emerged into the tunnel. The arch was intact, the walls were intact, the floor was buried under perhaps 2 feet of fallen brick and silt, but the structure itself stood as it had been built 137 years earlier. Diamond walked the length of it, from the eastern wall back toward where the western entrance had once been. The vault echoed exactly as Whitman had described. The air was thick and still, the bricks were cold to the touch. For a few minutes before the news reached the surface and the photographers arrived, Diamond was the only living person who knew, with absolute certainty, that the Atlantic Avenue tunnel was real. The rediscovery turned Diamond into a small celebrity, and the tunnel into a minor attraction. For more than 2 decades, Diamond ran guided tours of the structure through an organization called the Brooklyn Historic Railway Association. Tens of thousands of visitors descended through that same manhole. Engineers and architects studied the construction, historians revisited the legends and discarded most of them. In 2010, the City of New York closed the tours, citing fire safety concerns and the absence of a secondary exit. Diamond fought the closure for years. The tunnel, at this writing, remains sealed once again, but for entirely different reasons than the ones that sealed it in 1861. So why was it really sealed? The honest answer, after every legend has been set aside, is that the tunnel was a piece of private infrastructure built to capture a corridor of trade between 2 of the most important cities in the United States, and that the political and commercial coalition opposing that capture proved stronger than the financial coalition that had paid for it. The tunnel was not sealed because of safety. It was sealed because the steamship operators, the rival railroad companies, and the Brooklyn property interests assembled enough political pressure in Albany to make the route legally unworkable. Private capital had built it, public legislation had killed it, and the men who lost their fortunes in the tunnel were not the kind of men who erected monuments to their losses. They sealed it, walked away, and moved their money into other ventures, and the story passed into the legends of the city. There is a lesson in this that the standard histories of American infrastructure do not usually emphasize. We tend to remember the railroads that won, the canals that paid out, the bridges that made fortunes. We do not remember the ones that lost. But those losses are part of the economic history of the country too. They are the shadow record of the same forces that built the successful infrastructure, and they show how that infrastructure was actually decided in legislatures and in lobbying offices by interests whose names did not appear on any of the public plaques. The Atlantic Avenue Tunnel is the most intact surviving example of that shadow record in the entire Northeast. It is still there, beneath the avenue, beneath the storefronts and the apartment buildings of modern Brooklyn. The vault still holds, the arch still stands, and the silence inside it is the silence of a question that the official history of the city has never fully answered. A silence that has now lasted very nearly 2 centuries.